This boy's name is George. Out of 4 siblings, only George had the biggest body. Because of living in poverty, the mother even had to divide the food into 5 so that everyone could eat. Even though their family life was poor, the mother taught her children not to complain and to always be grateful. Before eating, when the others focused on praying, George's expression actually looked annoyed. For him, in this poor life full of shortages, God was nothing but nonsense. At school, George was a smart kid, but because he was poor, he was often looked down on by his friends, even by his own teacher. He was also often mocked with the nickname Poor George. That day, fed up with being teased, George finally beat up his classmate and then left school. 7 years later, George was now 18 years old. Because he had dropped out of school and had no diploma, George was forced to make money by stealing. That night, while in action, George was shocked because his victim turned out to be a police officer. Luckily, he managed to escape. On his way home, he accidentally saw a TV commercial about a dormitory for a special government program that housed school dropouts. At the dorm, everyone would be trained with job skills, get free food, and a monthly salary. Seeing that opportunity, George immediately told his mother. His mother allowed him. She only advised that if later, when living independently, problems came, George should never give up and should keep focusing on reaching his dreams. Whatever happened, he must not go home until he became successful. His mother's words made George even more motivated. The next morning, after registering, George entered the dorm. In the room, when he opened his bag, George was very happy because it turned out his mother had bought him new shoes and a piece of paper with a motivational message. George then began to study enthusiastically. During break time, George was shocked because his new shoes were missing. At lunch with his friend named Desmond, George accidentally saw the shoes his mother gave him being worn by the thief. Luckily, a staff member named Duck came to break it up. Because of making a commotion and even damaging the dorm door, Duck had no choice but to send George home. In the car, on the way to the bus stop, George kept begging not to be sent home. He apologized while saying that this dorm was the only hope he had. Hearing that, Duck was silent, feeling pity. Then Duck offered, what if George became a boxer? With his body and strength, Duck was sure that one day George could become a successful boxing athlete. Even though he didn't understand boxing at all, just to avoid being sent home, George answered yes. At the training place, after putting on the gear, Duck explained several rules in the ring. When everything was ready, George began training. At first, George lost badly. Upset at being laughed at, George went to the locker room. Seeing George's anger, Duck tried to calm him. He advised George that he was too concerned with what others thought and wasn't focusing on learning. Even though George was strong, if he didn't master technique, he could never win. After practice ended, Duck began teaching George the basic techniques of boxing. While training, Duck explained that boxing wasn't just about throwing punches, but also about controlling the mind. If you could control your mind, you could control the flow of the match. Week after week, George kept training. 1 month later, during a rematch, George's movements looked much better, a 180-degree difference. With strong punches, he managed to win easily. After the match, George met Duck and asked to join the Heavyweight World Championship. He then showed a boxing magazine while saying that he wanted to be successful and rich like a famous boxer named Joe Frazier. Seeing the young man's enthusiasm, Duck explained that to be able to join the World Championship, George had to win several professional matches first. Since he was still a noob, Duck suggested that George train as hard as possible for a year to prepare. After 1 year of training, in 1968, George finally joined the amateur class selection match in Mexico. During the match, George kept being cornered by the opponent. Luckily, he was able to turn things around. George won and managed to pass the selection. Now he could fight at the next level, the professional level. Returning from Mexico, George happily met his mother. Seeing her son's success, his mother was very proud. A few days later, Duck told George to go to the city of Oakland. At the airport, George ran into a beautiful woman named Paula. After introducing themselves and exchanging phone numbers, they parted ways. Arriving at a training place in Oakland, Duck introduced George to a former professional boxer who would be his new coach. Before training, the former boxer reminded him, from now on, George had to prepare mentally because fighting at the professional level was not as easy as imagined. 1 year passed. In 1969, George began his debut as a professional boxer. Besides boxing, his relationship with Paula also grew closer. After getting married, year after year, George kept winning his professional matches without ever losing. After years of boxing at the professional level, George was finally eligible to fight in the Heavyweight World Championship. Even as a newcomer, he immediately dared to challenge his idol, Joe Frazier. Thankfully, he won. That meant he had seized the world champion title. To celebrate his victory, a party was held. George's old friend from the dorm, Desmond, also came to congratulate him. Seeing his friend's success, Desmond was very proud. Now that he was rich, George asked Desmond to be his personal assistant as well as his accountant to manage his finances. Hearing the offer, Desmond agreed. In the morning, after just finishing his shower, George saw on TV a heavyweight boxer named Muhammad Ali being interviewed. Muhammad kept commenting on George's boxing technique while challenging him to a duel. Hearing Ali's provocation, George felt challenged. In the afternoon at home, George invited his mother and siblings to celebrate his little daughter's birthday. During the party, they all laughed together, enjoyed the food, and were happy. In the past, even for food, one piece of bread had to be divided into 5, but now food was abundant. However, in the middle of happiness, Paula looked sad. Since becoming successful and wealthy, she felt that lately her husband had changed. George seemed no longer to love Paula. After the party, tired of George's attitude, the couple had a big fight, until finally, Paula asked for a divorce.
1 year later, in 1974, George accepted Muhammad Ali's challenge. At night, when everything was ready, the big match between George and Muhammad Ali began. Round after round, George kept trying to attack Ali. But because he kept attacking non-stop, his stamina was drained. In the 8th round, seeing George's punches weaken, Ali counterattacked. For the first time after 40 straight wins, George finally lost. That meant his championship title was now taken. After the match, very disappointed, George went home. 6 months later, one night to rebuild his reputation, George challenged 5 boxers at once. Ali was also there to watch. But even though George defeated his opponents, the audience actually cheered Ali's name. Emotional, George challenged for a rematch, but Ali refused. In the locker room, seeing his student frustrated, Doc tried to comfort him. Shortly after, George received a letter saying that now his younger sister was giving birth but in critical condition. George rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, after hearing his mother's story about his sister's condition, George was shocked. The only hope was God's miracle. In the middle of his sorrow, George knelt down. For the first time in his life, George prayed while crying. He begged, "God, take my life, not my sister's." All night, George kept praying non-stop, until in the morning, when he woke up, his mother told him that his sister and her baby were safe. Hearing those words, George could hardly believe it. It turned out God truly existed. God truly answered his prayer. 3 years later, one day George was seen fighting against a heavyweight boxer named Jimmy Young. But because of trauma from losing to Ali, George's ability seemed to decline. George lost. In the locker room, while frustrated, suddenly his body felt strange. In the midst of confusion, George seemed to hear a mysterious voice repeatedly calling his name. Unable to bear the spiritual experience he was having, George fainted. When he woke up, again his body felt strange. It felt like being newly born. There, George kept calling God's name and then poured water over his body. Since that incident, George became diligent in worship. Until one day, after setting his heart, suddenly George told Doc that he wanted to retire from the world of boxing. He wanted to become a preacher and devote himself to God's path. Hearing that shocking decision, disappointed, Doc left. A few days later, George was seen preaching on the street. After finishing preaching, he met and got acquainted with a beautiful woman named Mary. They then talked, getting to know each other. 7 years passed. In 1985, George had now become a pastor at his small church. He and Mary had also married and had 2 children. One morning at home while watching TV, there was news about 2 kids being caught by police for stealing. Seeing that news, George remembered his childhood memories. He then planned to open a sports center to teach poor street kids. The next week, after surveying a building location with Desmond, he immediately bought it. But after a few months, suddenly the electricity went out. When checked, George was shocked because all this time he had never paid the electricity bill. Feeling something was wrong, he went to the bank to check his financial report. The bank officer told him that his savings were gone, and now George even had debt at the bank. Hearing that, George was shocked. He couldn't believe all his hard-earned money was gone. That night, George looked for Desmond at a bar. Emotional, he chased Desmond and asked where his money was. Desmond apologized while explaining that all the money was gone due to a scam investment. Hearing the explanation, George fell silent, weak. The next day, George tried becoming an advertising model to earn income. He also sold souvenirs to his fans. But after counting, the money he collected was still not enough to pay off his bank debts. The next day, because he couldn't pay his debts, the bank was forced to confiscate George's sports center. From a distance, seeing the street kids unable to practice anymore, George's heart ached. He then went to see Doc. After telling him his condition, George begged Doc to train him again like before. Seeing his former student's seriousness, Doc agreed. But first, George had to lose weight. Hearing Doc's answer, George was very happy. A few months later, George started sparring, but due to age, George's stamina was no longer the same. He was easily defeated. In 1987, after 2 years of training as hard as possible, George tried challenging a professional boxer. George won. News of George's victory and comeback also went viral. Match after match he kept going through, until finally, George managed to enter the heavyweight world championship again. That day, he challenged the world champion title holder named Michael Moorer. During the match, George kept being cornered. In round 9, during the break, worried, Doc tried to stop the match, but George refused. Calmly, he signaled that he would definitely win. After the bell rang, the match resumed. George won. All the spectators were shocked, unable to believe that George, the old boxer, could win the match. In the noisy, festive ring, George didn't celebrate excessively. He chose to kneel and give thanks to God. He also hugged and thanked Doc, the coach who never tired of guiding him. Thanks to this victory, George was awarded as the oldest boxer in history to become a world champion. At 45 years old, George managed to regain his heavyweight champion title after it was taken 20 years earlier. In 1998, Charles "Doc" Broaddus was awarded the World Boxing Hall of Fame. George and Muhammad Ali became close friends.